want to talk a little bit about homeschooling. Now, I don't want to approach this from the angle of trying to think about how homeschooling would exist in a free market or anything like that. While I don't want to focus on that, I do want to say a few things, but I mostly want to talk about it in the sense that when you look at homeschooling and the arguments against it, it's one of those issues where it's really clear that the government is full of shit, and that the supposed reasons for the government service are retarded. Now, this is difficult, more difficult than other issues. So for defense, I would allege that all the money the government spends on the military, it's not really defense. They don't allocate those resources in any attempt to defend me or you or any particular person or even some aggregation of the entire American society. They spend those resources in what they think will benefit them the most. But it is difficult to actually prove that because hypothetically, theoretically, the stuff that they spend it on could be, I mean, it is possible that the Abrams tanks and F-16s or whatever could be used to defend my house or to defend my neighborhood. Even if they don't have plans to do that, they could make plans to do that. And so it can be difficult to say for certain that it's not actually a service to us, a defense service. The same could be said for lots of things like roads. They build roads pretty haphazardly. It's pretty easy to argue that they do a poor job, that they do it very expensively, that they don't maintain it very well. But it's a little bit harder to prove that they aren't just doing it for political points, a redistributive game of make me popular by spending money. They could argue, no, we really think this is the best way the road should be set up, or this is the best we can manage with what we have, and it's hard to prove it. Now with homeschooling, it's different. The whole ostensive reason to have government education is to make people educated, although like many other goods and services that the government supposedly provides, there's a tendency to homogenize that term, education, and kind of view a monolithic good, just like roads or defense. And this is just silly. Defense is not some overarching unified shield or infrastructure. It's made up of many individual components, marginal units, so to speak. When it comes right down to it, it will be a rifle or a gun or a suit of armor or a laser-guided bomb or whatever. And roads, there's highways, there's freeways, there's byways, there's toll roads, there's bridges, there's parking lots. I mean, there are people who spend all their time driving on freeways. There are people who spend none of their time driving on freeways. There are people who spend almost all their time on dirt roads. Some people, I mean, it's not a unified, homogeneous good. Education, obviously, not everybody has the same goals when it comes to education. Not all goals are, there's no uniform, you know, the reading, writing, arithmetic. Even if we were to select even one of those and just say arithmetic, for instance, that's not even a homogeneous good, because how much arithmetic? If I can add 2 plus 2, am I good, or do I need to be able to do, you know, very advanced calculus? Or do I need to be able to count binary numbers, or do we have to, the list of things that I could place under arithmetic, at least how the term is used in common English. I suppose there might be some more explicit definition of that exact word, but is enormous. And what are, you know, education is supposed to have that, but how much of that, how well are you supposed to know that it is enough that you took a class and got a C-? Or do you have to know it perfectly? Do you not even need that? You know, reading, how literate do you have to be? Do you have to be able to spell your name, or should you be able to analyze really complex texts and retain information instantly? You know, and who's to say that those 3 things are even the normative things, or what combination of those 3 things? If we were to say, well, you do need all 3, well, should you have more arithmetic relative to reading or writing? education is not a homogeneous good, just like no goods are, and a big part of the problem is that people imagine it that way, even though if you even think about it for a moment, that characterization breaks down. If it was a homogeneous unit, if education was one thing, then having some kind of standardized education might make sense. It still wouldn't meet a lot of libertarian criteria, but it might make sense. But when we have a system where there is no objectively better education among pedagogues, among people who spend their time learning how to teach, even within those who work within the public paradigm, the government paradigm rather, there's a great deal of disagreement on what ought to be in education. And most of what they think doesn't actually rise even above the is-ought dichotomy. So but that's all kind of an aside. The point is, the government says that it is ostensibly providing a service, an education, ignoring for the fact now that they're referring to something like it's a homogeneous good when it's not. That's the supposed reason for public schools. We need them for that reason, and especially for the poor. It's in the United States. This is actually less true in other countries. The idea is, well, we really need them for those poor people. That in the United States, there seems to be an understanding that at a certain point, it's probably not necessary for you to go to public schools. Certain people probably have the wherewithal to become educated without government subsidy. The cliche would be rich people, although even middle-class people can often afford it. But when you look at homeschooling, it becomes immediately apparent that the supposed reasons for government education are not the real ones. And why is that? Because home education typically is vastly superior to government education according to the rubrics of government education. Now, a lot of times homeschool is not a monolithic thing either. There are homeschoolers who take it. It's basically like regular public school in the house. And there are others who go so far as to basically do unschooling when their kids are basically completely at liberty to do whatever they want. And every gradation between, and every philosophy you can imagine, from atheist to Christian to Muslim to Jewish, picking some kind of idealized educational norm. But when homeschoolers take standardized tests, the tests that are used to assess public schools, they uniformly do very well. Uniformly, they do better than public school students. They do better than private school students. Not every single one all the time, but that is a fact. And if that being the case, then clearly there is no reason to force those kids to be in school. If the education is necessary to make people educated, but people are able to get educated without it, then it is logically not necessary. Now, in the United States, where homeschooling has become allowed, it wasn't really for a long time. This wasn't a federal thing. This is one of the things the states did. States had mandatory laws for attendance, and it was mostly religious people, but not exclusively religious people, who started to disagree with this. A lot of Amish people started to do this, and a lot of people started to go to jail in the 60s especially. And eventually, fortunately, the zeitgeist in the United States is libertarian enough that this didn't really fly, and homeschooling is now allowed, albeit with some regulation, depends on the state. In the entire United States, as far as I'm aware, maybe not in D.C. or something, but it's pretty much allowed. But if you look at other countries, this isn't true. Now, there's the place that always comes up with me is whenever I talk to Germans. one of my favorite kind of little fun things to do is to go on to places where there are Germans and say Germans are fascist and they hate freedom and all that, and then I get all this, you don't know what you're talking about, and there's a couple things I could bring up, but the most common ones are the anti-free speech, anti-free thought, Holocaust denial laws or such, and the other one is homeschooling, because homeschooling is not allowed in Germany. When people try and do it, the state takes those kids and says, you're not allowed to do that. You have a right to government education, which means you must have a government education, which of course is not a right. If you have a right, then the corollary of a right is to be able to ignore it. So it's not a right. They're obligated, according to the government, to go to public schools to get a state education. They have private schools in Germany too, but obviously they have to conform to whatever the state demands to be in operation. People who attempt to homeschool are prosecuted, the kids are taken, and this happens in quite a number of European countries, including the soft socialist, democratic socialist places like Sweden that are lauded all the time. And I'll point out, look, you guys aren't free, you don't allow homeschooling, and I always get, we don't want homeschooling, homeschooling's bad, homeschooling's stupid. It's not a lack of freedom to be denied something that's worthless. And we need it because if we didn't have it, nobody would be educated. People can't learn without the government, or at least the government sanctioned private school teaching them. And this is just blatantly false. It's quite apparently possible. Now, there are circumstances where it's unlikely. If your parents are on crack and they're criminals and they're drunk all the time and they're hookers, they probably wouldn't do a good job homeschooling you. Likewise, if your parents were like that and you went to public school, you probably wouldn't end up really any better. The story that got me immediately thinking about this was not from Germany, though. It was from Brazil. Now, I just had read that there was a family in Brazil. They had 2 sons, and the sons are basically amazing. I mean, they they passed some exams to go into law school when they were like 12 or 13 or something. And they've won a whole bunch of prizes, competitions for, like, not spelling bees, but like writing computer programs. And anyway, homeschooling is not allowed in Brazil, and their parents have been sued by the government repeatedly. And all these suits, they always make the kids take standardized tests, and they ace them, they surpass them. They even give them much harder tests than the standardized schools in Brazil actually require, and they ace those as well. And they've even had public school teachers in Brazil admit that they couldn't pass those tests, but these kids can. And I thought of that. Actually, when I read the story, I actually recognized the kids. Their dad, his name is Kleber Nunez, although my Portuguese is not that good, so perhaps I'm not pronouncing that correctly, is a high-ranking, founding, supporting member of Mises Brazil, the Mises Institute in Brazil. And I actually read about his homeschooling efforts 3 or 4 years ago, and now his 2 sons, he has a daughter as well who's like 5, but his 2 sons are like 18 or 19. And they're past the age of the truancy laws, but they've been fined, but they won't pay the fine, and they never took the kids. But it's kind of a joke, because if the reason we need the government schools or to make people educated, these kids are objectively, or as objective as you can be, they are not only educated, they are more educated than public schools are making kids. And so that can't be the reason they have to go to public school. That can't be the reason for the attendance laws. Because if it's demonstrated that, at least in a particular case, that a child has at least the same level, if not higher, of education as the state schools, then there's supposedly no reason, right? But the states never accept that, even when they can, by their own standards, prove that the kid is, or demonstrate that the child is at least, or if not more, educated than the public schools. They still insist that they attend, which is a glaring piece of information that indicates that the real reason isn't about education. And think about it logically. This is something that John Taylor Gatto, I think I heard him say this probably 10 years ago almost now, makes really clear. If, let's say you're a pedagogue and you figure out a way that you can teach kids, you can take any kind of kid with any degree of, or lack thereof, of education, and in a certain amount of time, maybe it's a couple months, maybe it's a couple years, you can take them and you can make them highly intelligent, you can make them self-sufficient, you can make it so they're capable to take care of themselves and actually create a surplus, and that they're, you know, that they're basically a high-functioning person. And you go to the government and you say, hey, let's do this in public schools. Will the government institute that? No, that would be institutional suicide for the government, because if you could actually create people like that, and I'm not saying that that is something that we can build factories to produce, I wish it was true, but it's not, but they would not do it, because if they produced people like that, then those people would either be much more difficult to control because they'd be intelligent and they wouldn't be able to be convinced by bullshit, or even more likely, they wouldn't need a government at all, because we're always told we need a government for those who fail in society, those people who aren't able to take care of themselves, those people who are not only can't take care of themselves but are so morally abhorrent that they would commit crimes otherwise, and so we need the state to prevent all that. There's lots of problems with that argument, but if you could produce people who didn't have those flaws, then the reason for having the government is gone. You know, it's like saying we need the government to keep leprosy away, and if someone says, well, I can cure leprosy, then you wouldn't need government. Well, if the reason we need government is because people are ignorant and stupid and unable to make ethical or moral decisions with enough frequency to have a smoothly running society, then if we had an educational system that could actually deliver that, then the state wouldn't need to exist anymore. And so they'll never ever do that. So this is kind of prima facie evidence that the main focus of the public schools is an indoctrinary one. It's to make, I don't think it's explicitly to make them pliant to the state, but pliant to authority, and to be not critical thinkers, and to have kind of a cultural worldview that puts a position for the state that's pretty important. So the state isn't usually represented as God, but like when I was in school, it's kind of represented as society's getting better because the state's taking a bigger and bigger hand in it. And society was worse in the past because the state wasn't, you know, as intrusive as it is now. That's the kind of the zeitgeist that you get from public schools, and that's not an accident. And when you have people who are educated outside of public schools who are even more educated than people in public schools, ostensibly that should be fine. And the fact that it's not indicates that the reasons for, the supposed reasons for public schooling are fallacious. So the other interesting thing about the topic is that the arguments that people use against, it shows the intellectual hypocrisy of statists, because the arguments that they would use against homeschooling, all of them would completely invalidate public schooling. So I'll hear, listen, yeah, it sounds good, and if the parents are competent, maybe they'll do a good job, but what if a kid doesn't learn very well? You know, we shouldn't allow homeschooling because there's a chance that a kid might be homeschooled and not learn anything. And that's absolutely true. It's more than a chance. It's bound to happen. It happens now, I'm sure. Okay, but if a kid goes to public school, there's a chance that they won't learn anything. And in fact, it happens pretty regularly. And whether children succeed or not in public school seems to be much more related to their personal life than something about the school. Okay, like my public school, most of the kids were pretty high functioning, and most of the kids were pretty successful, and they were pretty good at school, but most of the kids had, you know, two parents, pretty stable family life, you know, decent income. There wasn't like a rich area, but people weren't in dire poverty. And the kids who did come from dire poverty, who did have parents who were on drugs or drunk all the time or unemployed or on welfare, those kids, they didn't do so well in the public school. In fact, they did pretty terrible. So if homeschooling is, and this is, and that, I mean, if you go to the rich suburban area and the public school is good, right? And then you go to the public school that's servicing hordes of, welfare bastards. The school that's servicing the welfare bastards, it's producing shit. It might have hundreds and hundreds of kids, and it might only have tens who, are in any meaningful sense educated or able to maybe consider going to college or anything. The rest of them, it's completely worthless. And is it because like the public school teachers in the rich town are really good, and the ones in the administrative systems of the two are the same? And the difference is, in the one, the parents or the families generally have better kids, and the other ones in this, if a family is shit, the government isn't going to produce shinola. Or that doesn't make sense, gold. But if it's gold, it doesn't matter what you go through. So, sure, it's possible that a homeschooling family could fail, but if that means that homeschool families are invalidated, public schools fail all the fucking time, so aren't they invalidated? That can't be. I mean, it's an extremely weak argument. The others, they'll say they won't get socialized. That's really not true. It's not like you can't be in Boy Scouts, Little League, choir, church group, youth group, Girl Scouts. That's silly. There's plenty of socializing that happens outside of school, to the extent that that's even like something that you need. So it's pretty evident to me, and I mean, when I went to college, I was in like an education field. I had to take a lot of education classes, and like the thing you realize, although it's never made explicit, or at least it was never made explicit to me, but it was like plain as day, is that if the families are high functioning, or at least competent, the kids are going to be okay, whether or not the public schools do well. If the families aren't, then the public schools are not going to be able to do anything. The other argument I've heard is someone posted on the article about the Brazilian kids, like, yeah, homeschooling sounds fine, but I've known too many examples of really outstanding kids who were squandered in homeschool. Like, they were really brilliant kids, but since they were homeschooled, they weren't allowed to develop fully. I've never heard of that. I've known a couple of homeschool kids. In college, I knew kids who had been homeschooled. I knew kids when I was in high school who were homeschooled. Even though they supposedly don't socialize, I knew more than a few. And I've never known that situation where somebody was held back by homeschooling. But even if it does happen, which I'm sure it does, doesn't that happen in public schools all the time? Like, literally all the time? I know, for me, the subjects that I didn't care about, the teachers typically knew more than me, and typically I would be forced to learn something in those classes, or, I might learn something in those. But in subjects that I really cared about, that I was really interested in, like history or music, there was nothing, I mean, history especially, there was nothing even remotely challenging to me. I mean, it was like somebody who wants to do calculus, and you go and you're doing, addition or counting, like you have your math question is like, it's got a picture of 3 bananas, and it's got a plus sign, and it's got a picture of 2 more bananas, and then like it's multiple choice answers, and each A has like a picture of 3 bananas, and B has a picture of like 4 bananas, and C has a picture of 5 bananas, and you're supposed to circle the right. If you wanted to do calculus, that would not be the best place to learn. You'd be kind of held back. And that's what public schools are like. I had lots of friends who were like geniuses. I mean, I had a friend who, we were roommates in college, but we were friends all through elementary school and whatever, and he triple majored, and he's a doctor now, but like when we were in elementary school, his parents were always bitching and saying, well, we want him to be doing this. We don't want him to be doing regular math. We want him to be doing advanced math. And the school's like, look, we have 1 4th grade teacher. What? He's not going to teach your kid extra stuff. You know, she's only teaching one class. Everyone's going to learn how to add bananas. All right. Your son, who's in 4th grade, who probably could be doing advanced geometry and algebra and maybe even a little bit of calculus, that's not on the table. So there, that happens all the time, millions of times a day. It happens to everybody, even kids who aren't geniuses but who are really interested in this or that topic. They're not catered to, or hardly ever, and if it is, it's just an accident. So if the stifled brilliance is something that would invalidate homeschooling, again, even more so for public schooling. Now, the other kind of argument here, and again, these arguments just come out of nowhere, but it's like, well, yes, if the parents are high functioning or if they're college educated or whatever, then I guess it's understandable they would be able to teach their kids. But poor people, they're not able, or people who aren't experts in pedagogy, they're not able to do it. Well, first of all, that's a bullshit argument, because in Germany or in Brazil, when the parents are high functioning and when they maybe even have university degrees or whatever, maybe even be public school teachers, when they try and homeschool their kids, the government doesn't say, oh, well, education's a really important thing, and normally we require people to go, but since you're qualified to homeschool your children, we're just going to let you do it. No, they say, no, you still have to send your kids, even if, your parents could be literally physicists at some university, and they're going to say, no, you are not qualified. The person who took 4 years at a school, and they had two general ed credits or whatever, they're the ones who are more. No, that's not a real argument. But they've done studies. Not all homeschoolers are fancy-dancy rich folks. Okay, a lot of them are actually, not by proportion, but a lot in absolute numbers they're minorities, they're lower class, they're middle class. And the studies are that even though they might not do as better as the super rich kids, like the guys in Brazil, their family is obviously wealthy, they still do better. Like if you take, and it's been a while since I looked, but if you take like the worst category in public schools, which are like black, single parent, low income people, those black single parent low income people where the parent isn't highly educated, might not even have a high school diploma, those kids do better than the white suburban kids in public schools on average. Not everyone, I'm sure, on average. So statistically, and actually this is an argument why public schools are racist, a lot of people say, because blacks and Mexicans always do worse in public school, but when they get homeschooled, the differential either disappears or is much reduced. And you would think that would, be enough, but it's not. It's really important for the state's point of view to have that 12 years to do whatever it can to shape kids. Not so much because they care about kids, but because they care about adults, and that's what kids are going to grow up to. And so this allegation that it's there to educate you, it's obviously bullshit, because people can get educated without it, obviously. So a little bit, I'm not someone who thinks that homeschooling is like the answer to everything. I would predict that if we had free markets right now, or at least a free market in education, that doesn't mean everybody would homeschool. I think that the brick and mortar institutions would not disappear, although they'd become much more reduced, and you'd see them kind of become the market options at the top and the bottom end of the pay scale. I think that you would have like schools like we imagine, but they might even be more like boarding schools where you actually live, where there's very, very intensive curriculum, very, very highly qualified teachers, and some kind of rigid or philosophical conception of education, something like an academy, and that would be really expensive, and rich people would want to send their kids to those. And some of those exist right now. There are private schools that are not simply parochial schools or simply apes of public schools. There are schools like that, and they would exist, and there'd be more of them, but I don't think that would be something that your average person would go to. That would be something for the wealthier people or the poorer people who are really interested in it. I think the price would be low enough, if we're talking about Libertopia here, that even middle-class people, if they really thought that that was something worthwhile, they would be able to afford to send their kids there without, selling the car and mortgaging the house. On the other end, I think you would see basically charity schools for like orphans, for the crack baby children. Those are probably largely going to be religious in nature. Not exclusively. There's no reason to think that would be exclusive. But those would be places where the idea being, look, there are people out there whose parents are so inept that they can't even abrogate education to somebody else, and they would exist to kind of fill that niche. Everyone else would have not homeschooling per se, but some kind of at-home or less intense, time-consuming, hooked on phonics, 9-week Khan Academy kind of mixture. And it would be sort of, you'd either hire tutors, or you would, which could be online, or you would pay for courses that would be online. Say, hey, it's $300 and it takes 9 weeks, and when you're done, you can do, algebra or whatever. I wouldn't want to get too explicit, but I think that's likely what we would see. And not only would the results be better, it would be enormously less expensive. And it would be more productive because we wouldn't have this huge swath of time where basically young adults are prevented from taking part in the economy and learning. I mean, that's a learning experience too. That is just, it's not the reading, writing, and arithmetic. This very, very standardized, unimaginative rubric that only exists because people make the intellectual error of imagining education as a homogeneous good and not something that really needs to be tailored to everybody. How much you value it, how much and what you value in it is going to determine what your educational needs are. Or if you want to be a carpenter, then what you want in education is different than if you want to be a computer programmer or an astrophysicist. And there's nothing normative to say you're wrong, you shouldn't focus so much on carpentry or basic geometry or reading a manual versus reading fucking William Shakespeare. I mean, how many times do we all have to read Romeo and Juliet? Like I had to. Everybody has to. Isn't that just a little silly? That's just one tiny, tiny, tiny little example. But yeah, they're very, very expensive. They don't produce any kind of objective results. Since it's based on taxation, we can't actually say that there's a net benefit to society. In fact, it's pretty clear to me that there's a net loss. And so, yeah. But I think it's really good because it shows it's one of those examples where what the government claims to be doing and the reasons for its doing it are pretty obviously wrong. It's not about education. It's about control. And there I go again. I like to say a lot. It's one of my fillers, So, at least I'm semi-self-conscious about it. So, homeschooling is pretty awesome. It is a good reason that the United States is a good country. It's up there with gun control and free speech for reasons that the United States isn't quite as shitty as a lot of other places are. Which is, I mean, I don't have any kind of misapprehensions about the United States or its lack of libertarian status, but there are big differences. And when I talk to Germans or Swedes, the idea is completely foreign to them. I mean, really, the state is mommy and daddy, and they don't feel comfortable otherwise. And they accept its control over their lives, and that's one thing, but then to insist that others accept that control, that's quite another. And it's absurd because they think the control is there for their own good when obviously it's not. And the other, utilitarian argument here is the homeschoolers are educating their kids, but they're still paying for the public schools, and by taking that child out of there, they're freeing up more resources for all the other children. So they are having a huge net. I mean, not only are they becoming more educated, which has a net effect that's positive, they are still subsidizing everybody else without taking anything out of it. So you think that that would be something that they would welcome, and it's not. Because the one thing that the homeschooling can't be counted on providing, we can be pretty sure it will provide an education. It doesn't mean it always will. We can be pretty sure. We can't be sure that it's going to provide government indoctrination. And that's the most important thing.